Morgen. Ihr nehmt mich wohl nicht so richtig ernst, wa? Steht alle mal bitte auf. Mir mal nachmachen. Das sind jetzt ein paar Lockerungsübungen zum Auflockern der Muskulatur. Vor allem die Beine bitte. So, und jetzt im Gleichschritt. Links, rechts, links, rechts, links, rechts, links, rechts.
Was soll das?
Einfach mal nachmachen, ich möchte euch gern was zeigen. Ja, sehr gut. Spürt ihr das? Wie wir langsam alle zu einer Einheit verschmelzen. Das ist die Kraft der Gemeinschaft.
Wie lange müssen wir noch?
Bis wir alle absolut im gleichen Rhythmus sind. Das kennst du doch vom Tanzmonat. Links, rechts, links, komm. 1, 2. Mit solchen Schwingungen kann man sogar Brücken zum Einsturz bringen.
Du bist völlig aus dem Rhythmus.
Bleib ruhig, okay?
Ich glaube, so langsam haben wir es verstanden, Herr Wenger.
Das glaube ich nicht. Diese Übung verfolgt ja noch einen anderen Zweck.
Welchen?
Unter uns ist der Anarchiekurs von Wieland. Und ich möchte, dass der Putz von der Decke auf unsere Feinde niederprasselt. Das sind die wahnsinnig geworden. Macht durch Gemeinschaft.
Discipline without freedom is tyranny. But freedom without discipline is chaos. I've made it no small secret that American schooling, in my opinion, is more in the business of controlling people than it is in the business of educating them and creating critical thinkers. Schools in America were initially designed to train factory workers, and what's good for a factory worker is not necessarily good for an intellectual or a student. Factory workers are expected to come in at a certain time, perform tasks to a certain level, not speak out against the establishment, perform their duties, be just unique enough to solve problems that might show up on the work line, but not so unique that they can't be easily swapped out like cogs in a machine. American schooling hasn't really improved on this concept in the 200 years it's been established in America. And in reality, it's gotten a lot worse. Schools are more in the business of controlling what students think now more than ever. In this episode of the All-American Nightmare, out of step as we all get in line, we'll be discussing how schools have become fascism factories and machines for pigs, more designed on creating students that are easily subjected to the rules and ideas of fascism rather than critical thinkers who speak out against it. The clip you saw before was from a movie called Die Welle, or The Wave in German. It's a film that was based upon an actual experiment that took place in German schools to see if students would be in any way able to recognize a fascist autocracy taking shape and correct it. Now obviously the movie is a dramatization of that, and it goes a lot more severe in the movie than it is in real life. The school was in complete control of it the whole time, everything was really monitored, and they did shut the situation down long before it became a problem. But what was interesting is in the making of Die Welle, one of the directors actually took some time to go to American schools and see how we operate, to use as inspiration for how his autocracy might take place. It's quite telling that a film about fascism in schools and a rebirth of an autocracy and essentially a Nazi youth culture coming to parlance was used based upon American schooling, and a lot of people thought this movie was kind of just being rude about that, like picking out America because of the way we do things, just to poke fun at us. But then January 6th happened, and things kind of became full circle. Keep in mind, Die Welle was filmed in 2011, and the January 6th riot happened literally 10 years later. So maybe it's time we all sit down and discuss exactly what the children are learning in schools, and exactly how we've been controlling their behavior. Welcome to As Out of Step as we all get in line. So the first step with all things in these videos is to address what exactly is fascism, or a working definition of it, how exactly it's applied in schools, or whether or not schools use it actively, what are some of the more glaring issues of this, or the undeniable evidence, and then a way to curtail this. However, discussing the concept of what is fascism is literally a philosophical process in and of itself. There are people who have done entire master classes on the ideas of what constitutes fascism. Some people say that the ideas of Benito Mussolini and his militaristic dictatorship of Italy in the 1930s is the tried and true definition of fascism, while other people would point to the Nazis and the Third Reich under Adolf Hitler as a form of fascism, while other groups say that those are two militaristic standings and taken far out of context, and that fascism can exist in a paradigm, or exist on a spectrum, or exist in a varying tier set. As the quote I opened with dictates that too. Discipline without freedom is tyranny, but freedom without discipline is fascism. Sometimes you need a little bit of difference in between. So, how do we do that? Well, safe to say I have selected a few readings to kind of help us get a working definition we'll be going through with this video. Before going on, I would like to state out some small special considerations. I won't be putting a bunch of work into high school sports and the sort of boot camp, basic training mentality that comes up in high school sports in a lot of ways, mainly because that'll be resting for another video. I'm also going to hold off on military recruiters in school because as of the filming of this video, laws and mandates have been passed by numerous states to actually move military recruiters out of school and to limit the amount of contact military recruiters had with students in school, which is going to be more glaring operations. I will give a nod to it, but we're not going to go in depth as I originally planned. Now I'm going to list off 6 premises I've used to determine whether or not fascism even shows up in a system. I'd like to establish very early on that I do believe that fascist tendencies do tend to prop up everywhere because of how loose my definition is, and it doesn't inherently mean you're living in the Third Reich. However, in the same regard, we can apply these more openly to a variety of things, not just military or not just extreme things. It's a general medium, so of course, take this with a grain of salt. The first premise I'm going to establish is the need for a strong leader, aristocracy, or some type of a ruling power. Some group that has complete control over the party and its decisions. Premise number 2 is to have a disenfranchised, angry, or frightened populace that serves to social Darwinism. It's very important we establish here that social Darwinism is pre-established or pre-ingrained before the populace is entered in. Just having angry, frightened populace could mean a number of things, and in the same way that a refugee camp has a de facto leader who organizes and administrates things, it's not inherently fascist. What's important here is that there is an in-group and outgrow concept. The third premise is a goal or plan moving forward into the future to return to the way things used to be, a greater mythologized time. It's very important that going forward with the party, they have plans to retrogress, to a better past, never to go forward and improve things for the future. Fascism is not a concept of idealism or moral utilitarianism. It's always a concept of moving backwards. Being regressive is very important to point out with this. The fourth premise comes about through social injustice or some type of overarching issue to the populace or the party. That is to say, a group of people or ideals that are both weak and not deserving of the party's leadership, but also subsequently trying to destroy the party and what it stands for. An evil enemy from the ancient times coming forward to try and ruin things once again. It's very important to have a sort of demonized caste in these in-group and out-group policies. You can't just simply say, if you're not with us, that's fine, you do your own thing. It's very important to establish you're either with us or against us, and if you're against us, you are obviously the bane and cause for all of our problems. The fifth premise is a systematic basis of power that dictates control. This is another part of the in-group, out-group mentality. In schooling, this could be anything as mundane as a sports team, where either you're with the sports team or you're against us. The sports team comes first, to a club where when you're in the club comes first. You don't have friends outside the club. You only have friends inside the club. All the way up to you're part of the popular clique and we don't associate with people outside of our clique. It's very important in fascism that the personal identity is ignored and that people are grouped and categorized. There is no me when under a fascist system. There is only the system or the party and your part in it. It's very important to distinguish that. Fascism uses individuals to perpetuate a group mentality by making them hate each other. The final premise is a removal of critical thinking or critical figures from the party. Fascism isn't interested in entertaining other ideas. It's not even interested in having a democratic process. Fascism works when it initially subverts people's expectations and then blossoms when it has full control. and being able to speak out critically and talk about it really isn't in the interest of that. This is why it's so appealing for schools to use it on children, because children just don't know how fascism works or don't really understand what's going on to discuss it. I'm going to show another clip from Welle to just see how an actual classroom would discuss concepts of fascism.
Setzt euch bitte nach hinten.
Dank dir, Herr Wenger.
Wir waren gerade bei der Frage, welche sozialen Strukturen begünstigen das Entstehen einer Diktatur? Lisa?
Hohe Arbeitslosigkeit und soziale Ungerechtigkeit.
Gut so. Hohe Arbeitslosigkeit und soziale Ungerechtigkeit begünstigt sicherlich das Entstehen einer Diktatur. Tim?
Eine hohe Inflation, Herr Wenger.
Gut, Inflation.
Politikverdrossenheit.
Sehr gut, Caro.
Nationalbewusstsein. Ich meine, wir haben es ja alle gesehen bei der WM, als plötzlich überall die Deutschlandfahnen rausgehängt wurden.
War doch super.
Nee, ich fand's total widerlich.
Ja, genau, das war doch geil an der WM. Ja? Wenn die Deutschen nicht endlich wieder stolz auf ihr Land sein dürfen, wie jede andere Nation auch so, dann führt das doch nur zum Gegenteil. Dadurch entsteht doch der Hass auf alles andere.
Ich glaube, das, was Mona meint, das ist sowas wie extremer Nationalismus. Können wir uns darauf einigen?
So what you just saw there is probably one of the better examples of how teaching fascism should work. The teacher is ultimately moderating the discussion and moving the discussion along, but the students are allowed to trade off ideas. There were some pretty good conversations there. Social injustice, political disillusionment, inflation, the idea that if we all love our country and put ourselves for everybody else, it forms an in-group, out-group. But in the same way, if we make everybody equal and have no national pride, people will just form small enclaves that will just hate everybody else equally because they get to have nationalism when we don't. And it goes a long way speaking with this because of Germany's history with fascism in the past, obviously most infamously. But it's also very telling of how America does this, because America has a heavy preponderance on its militarism and its imperialism throughout most of its history. It certainly has a mythologized past that has a lot of dark spots that are just traced over. And the idea of America first and America being the best and America being the top dog dominant is pretty pervasive in our culture, and no one can deny that openly. So, let's take about this concept and our premises and kind of see how things operate. Remember the first premise? Well, do schools have a de facto organization, or someone at the top, a party or a group? Certainly. We have a principal, or a teacher, or a student body. There's a group and a party that serves to do what the school wishes it to do for the investment of the students. Now, one of the things I want to bring up here is that in America, the student body operates a little differently than in a lot of European or Asian schools. And same thing for a principal. In a lot of Asian schools, the principal almost never shows up outside of an administrative role, and if he does show up to talk to students, it's either in place of helping other teachers, where he forgoes his duty as a principal and operates as a teacher, or when he's handing out honors or certificates. That is to say, the principal is a principal and removed from the students, or he is a teacher and removed from the job of a principal. There's a power checks in play. In Europe, it's very unlikely that you'll ever bump into a principal in schools unless you commit some very egregious crimes, mainly because they have disciplinarian systems or other ways to go about that. In American schooling, however, very often than not, if you mess up, you're going to go right to the principal's office, and in a lot of cases, see some police officers there. This is mainly because of America's school-to-prison pipelines and how we discussed with the Reed technique, a lot of institutionalized systems turning teachers into inquisitors and principals into patrol officers. The same thing goes with the student body. While the student body is an actual functional organization group in a lot of American schools, it literally has no power that the school doesn't directly give it. It's a puppet state. Whereas in Japan, the student body oversees actual student affairs and governs the students, and in Europe, it oversees more or less the same thing. In America, outside of organizing assemblies and painting signs and doing small sporting events, the student body really doesn't do anything. But it is a ruling party. Being in the student body gets you points and awards, despite the fact it's mostly empty titles. Kind of like the Nazi elite. How about premise number 2? Is the academic environment designed for students in conflict? Oh, sure. Students are angry for a variety of reasons. Students are confused for a variety of reasons, and students are frustrated for a variety of reasons. As you saw in the clip, social injustice was one of the concepts brought up in schooling. And a lot of students in high school are full of vim and vigor to go out there and address the schools and the nation's growing problems with that. We see this with the rise of student youth organizations banding together to try and organize and become political at younger and younger ages. This also goes to another extent where students in high school are obviously scared. The world doesn't make sense, it's full of injustice. You've recently moved out of the nice, happy times of a child into the cold and cruel world of reality. You have teachers that may not like you all that much. You don't have the nice rose-tinted glasses to put things off. You're put in with students who have all these different views of poverty and disenfranchisement, and you're being made aware of it. You have a tribalistic social hierarchy you're expected to perform within, the clique attitude. You have teachers actively gunning for you and tests actively gunning for you. Not to mention, in a lot of cases, the hormones are starting to flow, and that's just a carnival of pain in and of itself. So I think it's not that far of a stretch to say that students are very angry and socially isolated in a lot of schools. If they weren't, there's a lot of things we need to discuss that are happening that shouldn't be. The difference is that in schools in Asia, a lot of students, along with the student body, work together to help alleviate those things. You have friends, you have colleagues, you have coworkers, people you can trust into. In European schools, much the same. You have soccer clubs, or a very social culture, or different ways you can go about it. In America, it's a lot different. Most American students' time is taken up at school. When they come home, they usually have a massive amount of homework that they're often told not to do with friends or not to do within study groups because that might be considered cheating. Students are kept very isolated, kept in constant working conditions. They go to school less often than European students, but they also get less breaks. And to pile on top of that, a lot of students usually have sports after school, which is just more of the same system, or they have extracurricular activities, or they go home and have their parents that they have to settle with. Younger students they have to attend to, siblings, what have you, so it makes a lot of sense that American students don't exactly get the same access to social conditions that other schools might, with breaks and time to themselves. Free time is just not a commodity in American schooling. This also compiles upon the fact that American schools don't really do mental health well. That is to say that the guidance counselor isn't so much an actual counselor you can go to see problems, and in American schooling, the way it's tribalized, anybody who goes and seeks help from mental health experts is ultimately just handing their social status down the toilet because of America's stigma against asking for help and recognizing that mental health is a critical illness. I remember growing up in school where ADHD and ADD was pretty rampantly spread throughout a lot of students, but instead of addressing how schools were inherent to this problem, most of the answer was just send them down to the guidance counselor, get a referral, go to your doctor, and get some type of tranquilizing pill to lock the kids down. Don't address the root of the problem, just take a pill to make them quiet and coherent. Same thing with neurodivergent or depression. When I suffered from depression, I had lots of people who simply told me, just go outside, go talk to people, be more social. But that's the problem with depression. It kind of prevents you from being social, so it's just making a bad situation worse. Now what about that third premise? A mythologized time that going forward we're going to try and get back to, regressing to a different path. Well, I made an entire video about how America's history is entirely mythologized, but in a lot of cases, people tend to definitely do this. This is totally a thing. Often in high school you're taught about the American dream in the 1950s, white picket fences, suburbanites, a paradise, people made a lot of money, houses could survive on a single-payer income. Despite the fact that that was only the truth in the way for a very select group of middle-class people who usually had money or were coming from money at the start of things. It was in no way the conversation being had by inner-city people, people of color, or most veterans after World War II. But that's a big premise that a lot of people push on. When you look at young conservative groups in high schools, they always kind of push this idea that we should move back to the 1950s. 1950s, America was on top. Same with the 1960s. That's where we want to go. Where the teacher could teach openly, and we had prayer in schools, and, every child came to school with their pants tucked in, and their shirt nice and ironed by their mother, who stayed at home and did nothing, and there certainly was a lot less dark people around here. Oops, sorry, did I say that? Yeah. America has a mythologized history, and most people think the 1960s was great. The 1960s and 1950s was only great if you were white. Now let's talk about those pesky little groups that are both a detriment and completely unable to help themselves. What types of groups do schools tend to demonize? Well, if you're about my age, which is just shy of 30, you know full well that there was a lot of people who were demonized. When I was growing up, watching DARE and anti-drug programs, rap culture, drug users, sex workers, in a lot of cases people of color and certain music types were very openly demonized. Being sex worker was a dirty and degenerate practice. Drug users were all super predators that were just looking to sell you drugs and leave you in a pit of despair and loneliness. People who disagree with teachers were seen as rebellious and punks, that they weren't going to go anywhere, because anybody who disagrees with a teacher is obviously destined to be flipping burgers their whole life. Oh hey, people who flip burgers, an essential skill, being a cook and working in food service, seen as the bottom of the chain. What about heavy metal music? Remember those Christians getting really upset about how Dr. Seuss is being canceled? Those same people came after heavy metal music like Marilyn Manson, Apocalyptic Satanica, Iron Maiden, Black Sabbath, and Metallica for being satanic. You know, if you play Pink Floyd's The Wall backwards on your recording, you hear a satanic message. When in all actuality, if you play a record backwards on most phonographs or record players, it just screws up the needle. What about rap culture? With the onset of movies like Straight Outta Compton and Boys in the Hood, we get to see the story of NWA and how a lot of rappers came about making rap music. Rap music was always about the struggles of disenfranchised youth raging against the people who oppressed them. And the funniest thing about rap culture is that rap culture wasn't just built for black people, even though it was often depicted and claimed that way. Thug rap or ghetto rap was seen as something that degenerate black people did in the hoods with their guns and gangs and shooting. When in all actuality, I remember growing up listening to NWA and the Wu-Tang Clan and really identifying with that, because rap at that time reached out to both white people and black people about the oppression and social injustice in this world. In a sense, early age rap, and to a greater degree rap to this day, still speaks out about the injustice and the hard times that are faced by people living in inner cities and impoverished areas, and how people really just use and abuse them. But yet, it was demonized because it went against this message of wholesome values. What about neurodivergent people? Now, I myself don't know much about neurodivergence, and it often has to be explained to me 6 and 7 times in research and readings to get a full grasp on it, but I have spoken with neurodivergent people. They were some of the most demonized groups in all of schooling, for one very specific purpose. They didn't do exactly as the schools wanted. Their brains thought differently. They functioned differently. They had needs that went outside the system. They thought differently, they spoke differently, they saw the world differently. And as I've said with the discussion of fascism, fascism isn't interested in changing the rules for other people. Fascism is interested in getting you all in step and locking you right into the goose march. What about LGBTQ people? Certainly they were demonized. I recall when I was in high school and identifying as gay or along the gay lines, because we didn't have LGBT at the time, it was if you supported what is now LGBTQI, you were simply gay, a monolithic term that's designed to make people hate or more easily disassociate you, a label. There was a kid who died. I do believe his name was Jeremy Cummings or Jeremy Lennings, something along those lines. He committed suicide by jumping off the roof of his high school due to rampant bullying on set, mostly by his school's administration, but also by individual students. He reached out to try and get help, went to different therapists, even went to his parents, and ultimately the school simply outed him without his say-so. His parents threatened to send him to a conversion camp, so he committed suicide. The next day, I remember wearing purple, and a sign of solidarity for those people who died and were victims of bullying who were in the LGBT spectrum. And in all actuality, what this led to being is a lot of kids at school making fun of us for wearing purple, to the point where literally a man had just committed suicide and we were deciding that it was still okay to make fun of him because he was an ostracized group. Let's also discuss people with medical issues, both mental and physiological. Well, granted, no one's going to say it above you or to your face, there's always people behind our backs making fun of people with neurodivergency or special needs. There's always people using derogatory slurs, such as the R slur, in reference to people with Down syndrome or other such mental disabilities. Even though those people are still full physically capable of engaging in society, just like everybody else, they just have certain qualifications. And we recognize that because there's laws about it. But yet, they were still seen as the out group. Something to be kept off to the side because we couldn't just get rid of them. That's really screaming of the fascist tendencies. So how about premise number 5? Yeah, schooling has a systematic de facto power system. I call it tribalism, but a lot of people refer to it as social Darwinism. You have your clique, and the clique has a social hierarchy, with the rich, affluent people being on top, and the less together and less connected groups at the bottom. Same thing with sports teams. The varsity athletes are on top, and the JV below them, and then the special teams. This is all in a movement to keep children organized. How many movies have we seen where we have one group of kids who has the potential to move up in the social ladder, and they turn on each other and become savage and vicious, tearing apart their own friends to move up in the social hierarchy. Well, that's the social Darwinism at work. Things like social suicide being a concept. Hey, if you do that, or you say this, you're committing social suicide. That's a concept of social Darwinism. It's a system of fear designed to keep children in line. Don't speak out against the teacher. That'll put you down the social ladder. Don't be weird and crazy. That'll put you down the social ladder. Don't wear certain clothing items. It'll put you down the social ladder. Don't talk about this in school. It'll put you down the social ladder. This is not actually students controlling this, by the way. This is almost always done by the upper tiers of the school, trickling down, letting the students do their dirty work. As the old saying goes, Hitler never killed anybody. But he didn't need to. He had people for that. It's the same concept. Just as the principal's hands are dirty for perpetuating this system, but because we can't directly tie it back to him, people pretend that there's no link, when there very much is a link. Now, how about that critical thought? Do schools often shunt children with critical thinking skills off to the sides? Yes, in a variety of ways. Much as I said that people with mental issues or neurodivergence are often separated into special classrooms where they're away from the general populace, we also see this with children who speak out against the teacher having to sit at the back of the class or being socially isolated. We see this with the school-to-prison pipeline. Schools or children that struggle in school or have difficult home lives are simply put into prison and whisked away. I remember in high school that 2 people got pregnant, 2 women specifically, got pregnant, and the families were entirely okay with this. Both of the people were 18 and seniors at the time, and everybody seemed to be okay with it. But because this looked bad upon the school, having pregnant teenagers, they were shunted out of our school and into a different special school that they said, quote, was designed to meet their needs. When in reality, we just didn't want to see children having sex. So yes, schools very much dismiss, imprison, or change all types of ways. There is an entire system designed to move children out in and around schools. But no one ever asks why the children are being moved. What is the problem with a student being pregnant in school? Aside from the obvious connotations therein. If they're 18 and of age, obviously it's not much of a problem. But what about students who speak out against teachers? If you say a teacher's wrong, or say that the Trail of Tears was actually a horrible injustice and that it should be taught in schools, and that white privilege should also be taught, you're likely going to see yourself marched down to the principal's office for disagreeing with a teacher or speaking out of turn, and a punishment will be levied. That's the thing, too. Critical thought and disagreeing with a teacher happens because the teacher has a very specific line of rhetoric, and they are preaching that line of rhetoric, and to denounce them is to denounce the authority. Remember back to that clip, how Herr Wenger is walking around directing the conversation and making the nuances to keep things civil, but still allowing the children to have diversifying opinions. That is rarely seen in a lot of schooling. More accurately, it's the starting clip. Herr Wenger comes into classroom, tells the students what to do, they stand up and follow the orders blindly. It's a big consideration to note that America has a systematic response for children who disagree with them, but does not have a systematic implementation of open discourse and thought as a basis. Rather, we put draconian enforcement of lawless rules first before we put the open spread and concept of ideas outside of our own personal spectrums. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, hey, you said these are just premises, and obviously not all American schools follow this attitude. There are plenty of examples of schools that don't follow this model. And hey, let's apply this to European schools. We see some European schools that have the same kind of concept. To which I would reply, yes, that is entirely a just and valid counter to my points I put forth. But here's my counter, or my rebuttal. Number 1. This is the all-American nightmare. I don't have a lot of experience in European or Asian schools, so I can't really speak on that topic. So I'm going to have to either hold my opinion or claim no opinion in this case. Number 2, this doesn't decry the fact that fascist tendencies are still cropping up in schools in a very toxic mannerism. By just saying, well, not all schools do that, is to completely ignore the fact that, yeah, but a lot of schools still do it. And that's the problem. If it occurs at all, it's a problem. 0% of fascism is good. If only 2% of schools are fascist, that still means 2% of schools have a problem. Or the other counter we can go with this is, yes, and as I said, not all schools have these tendencies, and some schools have these tendencies in only specific cases and not in others. And that's fair. If the general take of the school doesn't have these classes, it's only a few bad apples, and by that I mean literally a few bad apples of teachers doing this, it's still a problem. The saying is a few bad apples spoil the bushel, not we can throw out the few bad apples. which, trust me, I've met most people. The concept of just throwing out the bad apples is not one people generally accept. If they did, we wouldn't have had the January 6th riot now, would we? So now I'd like to switch gears and talk about exactly where this fascism started cropping up. Obviously, it's always been a prevalent part of our system, but why has it only been recently seeing a lot more attention? And, well, that's a big thing to discuss about. It actually is kind of coming at the problem from the wrong perspective. You see, most people only kind of noticing fascist tendencies in schools because, well, we happen to know what fascism is when taken to its logical outcome, and we also are only really starting to recognize it. As I've said, the American schooling system hasn't really changed in 250 years, and this idea of entrenched fascism has probably been around for that amount of time, it just hasn't been recorded or documented. As I said in my video about whitewashing the dishwater, history is written by the conquerors, and if the conquerors achieve their ends through fascism, they're not going to tell you about how they did that. Obviously, they're going to mythologize it. So that's one aspect. The other point, too, is that really American fascism has really started cropping up in our recent studies in a very visible way around the time of the late 1980s, into the early 1990s, when two big things happened. Number one, a zero-tolerance policy was accepted in schools. Initially, this was brought about by the war on drugs. Allegedly, under the Reagan administration, there was a bunch of drugs moving through American schools, despite the fact that during research we found very few drugs move through American schools, if they move through at all. And this is across the board. There's not a lot of drugs moving through schools. Any amounts that are found are typically small or not noticeable. It's not like we're using kids to pack 3.5, 4 kilos of coke through American schools to the dealers on the other side. It's just not happening. But under the Reagan administration, there was fears that it would, mainly as a result of racism and blaming the quote-unquote super predators, that is to say black African-American males, for the cause of all these issues. So this led to a zero-tolerance policy, which allowed teachers to become police officers and to push a lot of drug task forces into schools, which really amped up the fascist policies. We had literal police marching around schools. We had teachers on the constant lookout for divergent behavior, that is to say people selling drugs, people having weapons, and of course there are plenty of stories of children pointing chicken tenders at teachers and saying bang and being thrown in jail, someone holding an army man with a gun and playing around with his friends, all the way to the point where when I was in middle school, you couldn't go outside and play cops and robbers and make finger guns with your actual hands because that was seen as violating the zero-tolerance policy. But this also led to another thing. It led to a very strict curriculum, that the curriculum was to be taught and not to be questioned because students who question might be susceptible to these super predators. They might become victims. We have to protect the children by basically regimenting every aspect of their lives. The other big thing that happened actually happened in the 2000s. It was called September 11th. Now, if you were my age, which was about 7 at the time, you were probably sitting in math class doing arithmetic, and then you got sent home where you tried to watch TV, but everything on the news was these planes getting crashed into the towers. And if you were about my age, which is about 7 or 8, you probably didn't know really what was going on. You understood what was going on, but you didn't really process it. But you certainly did understand the next few years growing up, where every moment of your life was bombarded with militaristic propaganda, where you were basically told that if you think certain things or question what the news media or the general nation's rhetoric was, you were unpatriotic. People like Noam Chomsky and George Carlin were decried as saying, oh, these are just radical dissidents who are unpatriotic and they don't support America. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. Anybody who speaks out against our troops is just, they want the terrorists to win. That was common rhetoric, and it was fed to me at a very young age throughout most of my life. And it makes sense that after all those years, looking back on it, yeah, there was a lot of fascism that moved into schools under the guise of American patriotism. And it proceeded that day. I remember not being allowed to have debates on the Gulf War, the Iraq War, the war in the Middle East, the various wars in the Middle East, because it was seen as unpatriotic. I was constantly told to respect the troops. Even if a troop speaks out against you, or you don't agree with a soldier, it doesn't matter. You need to agree with them. If you don't agree with the troops, you're against the troops, and you're basically just as bad as the terrorists. This is supporting the in-group out-group currency. And the way we can justify this is because we are a nation that was attacked, and obviously the enemy could still be lurking around every corner. Except instead of being the kids who spoke out against teachers, it was the terrorists. A perfect example of this to explain my point is a figure who recently died, Rush Limbaugh. A lot of people like to believe that Rush Limbaugh was, just swept up in this crazy current of patriotism and nationalism, and, even though he said certain things, it was a general belief at the time. But I remember it differently. I remember riding to school every day and listening to Rush Limbaugh on the bus radio because the bus driver picked. He was a pretty bloodthirsty person, and he went a long way to weaponizing a lot of children, young men my age, into wanting to go into the military and wanting to go and kill the enemies of America. And the schools helped advocate that. I was serving my part in the party, the American party. We were the world police, and the terrorists were the enemy, and anybody who wasn't with us was against us. I fell for that. And I'm ashamed to say I did. I also know that it wasn't for teachers in the media, I probably wouldn't have fell for it. But what matters isn't what I wish, what matters is what I did and what I believed in. And I don't want anybody to have to go through that ever again. And that's why I'm making these videos. Partially the reason. But think about that. That same rhetoric never went away. We never dialed it down. We amped it up. And as a result, what do we have in our current day? Transgender students are having their very existence questioned. People actively call Demo-rats or demon rats and Republicans because it's my team versus your team. There is absolutely zero ability for political discourse to occur unless it's my side versus your side. And your side is always the evil one, and my side is always the truth and the light. Now, obviously, I'm not going to make anybody say, this is my meaning of going out and talking to people. You do what you will do, and I will do what I will do when it comes to politics. I have no input into that life. And I'm not saying that people who want to reach across the aisle need to go and become friends with Klansmen. Far from that. If you have someone who's willing to sit down and talk with you about things and actually hash out some details, as we see with Havenga, by all means go for it. But you are under no inclination to take this video as me calling out for unity or justice. I'm merely pointing out that fascism in schools has only gotten worse, and that's what's led to a lot of political dissidents nowadays. Not that you are under any requirement to change that. So before we move into the wrap-up, I want to cover a few things before we get into the nitty-gritty of how to prevent this, or how to curtail it. There are some fascistic tendencies that do have a time and place in American education. For example, in team sports. You do need discipline, a strong power structure, and the ability to function as a cohesive unit in a team setting. And that sometimes requires you to demonize the enemy team, to provide more aggression, to fight harder, to win the day. And that's fine, because we do moderate that with the idea that the team works as a cohesive unit. You don't have this person's in this peer group, this person's in another peer group. When you're in practice, the team is a team. You win together, you lose together. The strongest point is as a unit, not a weak link. And team with an interior power struggle or power structure that's in conflict isn't going to last very long. It's going to have issues, it's going to cause problems, and this is what we've seen time and time again. A unit has to be cohesive. And that's kind of actually how we stop fascism in schooling, by moderation and correcting certain components. But obviously we can't do that with every class and every setting. Not all schools can be team sports, and it's dumb to try and think there's a one-size-fits-all solution. So I've come up with 5 specific ways that we can prevent fascism. As I always say, you can pick and mix or see which one works best for you and how to apply it. The first one is to promote an open exchange of ideas and discourse. As we saw in the video clips from Welle, we have a teacher who is offering up a moderating position. There's good faith arguments going around, things that people can accept with. The concepts are moving back and forth. The children are discussing ideas, maybe discuss the pros and cons of fascism, or, as I've done in this video, how to moderate fascism when you come into conflict with it. Can you work around it? How do you when you encounter this in the real world, how do we work with it? Or how do we work around it? However, I'm going to put in some stipulations on this. If we wanted to do an open exchange of ideas and discourse, that is to say, openly discuss things with a fascist or a potential fascist, crypto-fascist, we're going to need a few things. Number 1, good faith arguments. We can't have the fascist person or anybody else running around making basically, for lack of a better word, bullshit arguments. Arguments that are made in bad faith, arguments that are leering at the side of our eyes, arguments that essentially just said, well, just believe me, I promise I won't do anything bad. We can't have that. Everything must be in good faith, and everything must be in a standing of people want to improve. That the fascist element isn't going to try and subvert anybody. It's going to be out and about with what it's doing and promote its merits. Another thing you're going to need is honest acceptance. If the fascist tendency does have a benefit, i.e. discipline in a sports team, accepting that as saying, yeah, we can't really have a sports team without some degree of regulation. We can't just have kids running out there with whatever clothes they have on and no dress code, no implementation, no regimentation of training. Obviously, we need that. And that's a good thing in schooling and in teaching as well. Should be some regimentation. But in the same way, we'll also accept that if it goes too far, it becomes a problem. Or when the team starts demonizing other teams, it can be a big problem for other students if they have friends in that school, or to kind of start the process into irrationally explaining fascism. The third thing you need is to be open-minded about this. Obviously, if the fascist comes in trying to subvert people, they're not going to be in the habit of actually having a discourse, and they're going to be completely trying to overturn every angle as they go on. Just in the same way, if people go into fascist just saying, well, you're a fascist and therefore I don't want to agree with the system, and we would just always work around the system, it's openly denying what might be best. Sometimes you have fascist systems in your life. Sometimes you can't easily get around them. Sometimes you do have to bite the bullet and work with a fascist system. For example, in a lot of businesses and CEOs, a lot of the times in order to get into the ranks to do something, you kind of have to capitulate to your boss, who might run things like a fascist. Instead of just saying, I'm going to quit this job and not going to engage with it and move on and hope for better prospects, sometimes it's best to wait and see how things work out and use that to your advantage later on. This is in no way promoting the idea of a fascist element. This is only saying that when it shows up, how do you combat it in one way, is unfortunately learning how to work with it and work around it. A second option, which I hold to be a much better idea, is to hold mock discussions about the direct topic. This goes really far in schools. This goes even farther than learning how to work around fascism. This learns how to associate it and how to kill it, and it's probably one of my preferred methods. As we saw in the clip from Welle, Welle was walking around moderating the students' discussions, telling them keeping things civil, but allowing the students to openly discuss things, and we had some conflicting opinions, each of them in their own right. By having teachers make one student promote the benefits of fascism, a topic they might not like, and therefore having to defend it will be even more difficult, versus students that have to speak out against it, will allow students to actually combat different ideas and try out different aspects, develop their own methods for combating the system. Some students prefer to go very logical and solid. Some students prefer to use historical concepts. Some students prefer to be out and about and just shoot it down. And hey, every system is valid. This also would encourage students to commit to open and note fact-checking. A student doesn't have to be the one out there decrying the information of the students or actively engaging in the discourse. They can be fact-checkers. Not everybody in a discussion or a debate has stage. Fact-checkers are actually more important, and a person who'd rather be off to the sidelines providing support, who can be on their phones running through the different statistics and evidence brought forth and making sure it's all kosher, is a solid element to that too. This also goes back to an old saying I had with the read technique. The bear that sees the trap can't be caught. When presented with an argument with a fascist, and you've been trained on how to combat her, you'll be more easily equipped to handle that in real life. And you'll be more easily equipped to help keep the system from getting out of control. Like I said, the best thing to do with fascism is to actively confront it and actively take it down. Like I'm doing right here. A third process would be the study and analysis of various examples. In order to beat our enemy, we have to know how our enemy operates. And this can go far into teaching about history. As I said with my last video, discussing and stopping to mythologize American education and using our dark history as a presence to learn how things move forward is a really critical thing. How do we do this? Well, first and foremost, we need to look at how the conditions are required to grow fascism. What type of environment does the system need for it to prop up, and how can we be on the lookout for that system? How about how it operates over its life cycle? The sort of concept into taking control. That thing that a lot of people claim refugees in Europe are doing, sneaking into the country, asking for representation until they have complete control, and then taking over the country and forming it into Londonistan. Yeah, that alt-right talking point. Fun fact, that exact system is how Hitler took over the Weimar Republic. And they recognize that it works because they try to do it too. But as we recognize the life cycle, we can see the different stages that to plot out a time frame and to say, okay, maybe right now it looks like fascism, but it doesn't seem to match that. Oh, now it's meet another critical part of its life cycle. This is where it's weakest and we can attack it. Or, hey, we now have enough evidence to say this is definitely going to turn to something worse and we can prevent it. The third thing is to recognize the after effects. That's your biggest thing when combating fascism. It's not about watching the conditions, which is number one, but of course the conditions can grow anything. It's not about recognizing the time frame and the life cycle, as we know what's going to happen, but it can always have the air of deniability. The after effects are really where all the evidence is laying. what this is going to lead to, what this is going to be a problem, what this is going to show up years down the road, what our children have to worry about. Just as fascism preys on children to get its system to function, in return, we can use the fear for our own children's lives from having to live through this again to prevent it. Much like in all things, the strongest strength is its greatest weakness. A fourth method, which I highly recommend, is to promote open movement of students between groups and allow organic flow of skills and subsets. So this actually goes a long way to my preferred teaching style, where I had students pick out what their own skill sets are good at: video and media, music and arts, language and culture, using these to help teach history on certain projects. And then not just having students who have one skill set and forcing them into a group with other students, because that typically evolves to one student or two students doing all the work and the other one's just skating by on a grade, but actively inspiring children to want to move into different groups. Hey, you do audio and visual stuff. You're not someone I usually hang out with, but I kind of want to do audio visual, so can you help me out and teach me how to do this? Essentially destruction of the clique behavior. Instead of having a set system that limits thinking, we allow students to move between groups and to help each other learn skills and trades to help improve a project. Multiple artists coming together to create something beautiful. Also, promotions of clubs and organizations. If your school doesn't have an LGBTQI club, by all means operate one, and then work with that club on other clubs that have combined interests. The cheerleaders need to do fundraising, and the LGBTQI club needs some help getting sponsorship for its school's club programs. So the LGBTQI club gets some volunteers, they help out the cheerleading squad with their fundraising operations, and the cheerleaders then, with that fundraising money, help sponsor the LGBTQI club. Now we form greater connections. Those people will be less susceptible to the in-group outgrowth thing because they have friends in that spectrum who have proven that they're willing to help in exchange for a decent trade. Same thing with sports teams. Sports teams should actively work together with the band to work together to, maybe the sports team wants the band to play a certain song to get them hyped up for the oncoming game. And in the same response, the band needs some help doing the fundraising, or the band needs some help moving some parts around, or the band needs help rehearsing for a big performance. And in that way, the two clubs can work together. This isn't going to come out of teachers doing this, by the way. This has to be students reaching out to their friends on either sides to help them out. I want to also make very clear here that you're not required to go out and become friends with people that have actively worked against you in your life. I don't expect people in the LGBTQI club to hang out with people from the Turning Point USA crowd. It's just not going to happen. It just works out very poorly. But groups with similar interests, bands and a club trying to come together, or sports teams and orchestra groups can have some common ground, and that's where we work together. Stronger as a complete unit. The final method is designed to combat fascism in schooling directly, and that is a declaration or direct pushback against polarizing figures through democratic and civil ways. One of the big things about fascist tendencies in America is that they're almost always subversive. They never start out coming at you directly with what they're saying. They always use backhanded tactics to sneak around. So, the best way to do that is to combat them directly. Subverts don't really like it when they're dragged out into the sunlight. This will also require to have an actual student body that's capable of organizing against political figures. It's become a new common trend in a lot of right-wing circles to start moving controversial figures from conservative outreach groups, conspiracy theorists, and alt-right talking points into schools to come give talks to students under the guise of freedom of speech. This is in a lot of cases bad faith. Most of these political pundits and politicians have no place in schooling. There's really no point to come and educate children about politics unless you're going to educate them on the basis of the party's principles, which rarely they are. What they're doing is actively recruiting people that they have their hooks into already and can drag them more out, or to shame people in hopes of getting some viral footage. It's all about the culture war. So the first way we do this is to never actively say they can't come here. That's actually what they use as fuel on the fire. And as much as it pains me to say you can't just go out and tell a fascist, you're not welcome here, get out, you have to actually do this in a civilized fashion because it leaves them no room to actually argue around. The way we can do this is by a simple signing of a petition. If a bunch of groups don't like what Turning Point USA has to say, and there's a chance that one of their spokespeople will be coming to your school to use as a public venue, merely get a bunch of students to get together, sign a petition that says, hey, we don't want these people here, we think we should either say they can't come here because they're controversial, or students should have the rights to opt out, or we should put it to a vote by the student body as to whether or not we even want to have this speaker here in the first place. And that leaves up to the democratic process. If a bunch of students vote, hey, we don't really want them here, there's no purpose, what can they honestly say? we live in a democracy. Everybody has the right to speech, including the students. The students voted they didn't want to hear you, so I guess they don't have to speak. Also offering the option of, if the students don't win, and that the people do get to come and sprout their propaganda and fascist tendencies, the students should have the right to opt out. Not giving them the platform, not giving them their time is a great way to get around that. And it's engaging students in two very important political processes going off into their real world. Number one, that their votes matter and that they can emote change with voting. And number two, that if you don't agree with somebody, there is a way to make the political system work for your best interests. If the authority of the school is saying this speaker's going to come in and talk about it, and you say, hey, we don't agree to that, and they force it upon you anyways, you've now become the victim and actively are proving why fascism is a problem. And alternatively, if you do win out in a democratic standing, the fascist system can't say, oh, they kicked us out, those liberals are ruining our freedom of speech. You can just say, no, we live in a democracy and nobody wanted to hear what you have to say, so we figured since nobody wanted to listen to you, we could save you time and have you pass us by. No need to waste yours if you're going to waste out mine. That's a good system to appropriate, and it shows students that voting actually matters. Students often getting out of high school are the least likely to vote because they've grown up in a system that essentially has said your vote doesn't matter, fall in line, follow the establishment. So of course they wouldn't really have an opinion on things. It's only recently, until about 25, 26, that students really start voting en masse, and that's mostly because they actually start to recognize their consequences of their electees are starting to radically impact them personally. And that's changed recently in the past few years with things like the corona epidemic, the 2016-2020 elections, and so on and so forth. But this is a big thing too. It helps promote organizations and fundraising. Students are working together to solve actual problems in the world. That's one of the big things I want to get across with these videos, is that sometimes it takes students coming together and children using their interconnecting systems to fight a combat that really our generation just isn't equipped to handle. And in all honesty, it's been working out pretty well. This method, or this system that I've suggested, has already been entrenched in a lot of schools. It's been put to practice, and it seems to work out pretty well in a lot of cases. So it's an option, like I said, another tool for our toolbox. The biggest thing to remember, though, is to never demonize the fascists outright. They live off the fact that they have people trying to stop them. The best thing to do is let a fascist talk and then rip apart their arguments left-right. Bring them into the light and know how they're going to function and beat them to the punch. The fascist has to do his dirty deeds in the dark, and that's why they go after children and the susceptible, and they prey upon people. Making them hold their own in a direct conflict, you'll almost always win, because that's just not how the system is portrayed. If you have some other tactics, or you feel a better way to get across this, I'd be happy to hear about comments in the comments section and different ways to improve this. If you personally have done something along these lines to prevent a fascist system or to curtail fascism in your schools, I'd love to hear about your personal stories and talk with you one-on-one about how we can multiply this tenfold with the videos, with outreach, and with community guidance. That being said, that just about does it for this episode of On an All-American Nightmare, out of step as we all get in line. Hopefully you'll join me on my next episode where we discuss the enterprising of American schools and businesses moving in to do what teachers couldn't. I also would like to thank you all for your patience and acceptance of me changing the scheduled performance. I know this was supposed to be a prepackaged curriculum, but again, as I said in my last video, due to ethics policies and legal reasons, I had to change things. That being said, thank you very much, and have a good day.